Well, we're getting close to Christmas. And at this point today, we're going to witness the end of the Republic of Vietnam and the triumph of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, the unification, final unification of Vietnam. So then after today's lecture, we'll have our break, and then we'll resume on January the 5th, or is it the 6th? I'm not sure. We will have then several more lectures, and in those, we'll see what happened to Cambodia and to Laos. There'll be a sort of summing up, and we will, of course, review the remaining review questions. The exam, of course, as I've explained, will be 2 out of 6 questions, a shortened exam. So are there any matters that you want to raise at this point? Okay. So last time at the end, I was discussing the establishment of the peace between the United States and the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. That in order to reach that point, Nixon had massively bombed via North Vietnam, and also given General Tu this through Operation Enhance. He delivers $10 billion of military equipment, and the final deal is reached. Well, as part of that final deal, there was this idea of setting up a tripartite commission composed of DRV and RV people, as well as neutrals, which would implement the agreement. However, neither side really believed in the notion that somehow Tu and the National Liberation Front, not to speak of the DRV, would cooperate with one another. This so-called agreement was seen as a kind of a cover for the final American withdrawal, and both sides understood that the war would, at some point, would resume. Both sides prepared for the resumption of the conflict. Now, obviously the aim of Hanoi and the National Liberation Front was basically they were going at some point to launch a second great offensive. There had been the offensive of 772. Now with the Americans gone, they were leading up to a second offensive. Meanwhile, General Tu was trying to basically shore up his own defenses as much as he could, fearing exactly such a second great communist offensive. Now, so far as the United States was concerned, of course, with relief, they left Vietnam with a certain degree of honor. But in the aftermath of that, there was no question of them re-entering the conflict. The American troops had been withdrawn and they were not going to be sent back. Moreover, Nixon's ability to intervene in any way was crippled in 1973, because the reality was, if you'll recall, that in 1972, he had secretly sanctioned this clandestine group in Washington to basically break into the offices of various people. It started with Daniel Ellsberg, but it spread to different people who Nixon felt were sort of undermining the American effort. And at a certain point, always thinking about American electoral politics, Nixon sent them into the Watergate building. They raided the Democratic National Headquarters and they were caught. And this is in 72, I believe it's in June of 72. Well, these ultimately, these 30 or 40 guys who were basically arrested squealed. And although Nixon kept denying that he had any involvement, a grand jury investigation was instituted, and eventually the trail led back to Nixon. And so from March of 1973, the preoccupation in Washington was Nixon and Watergate, Watergate and Nixon. And he was consumed by this investigation. And until finally in August of 1974, he actually was impeached and forced out of office. Nixon was removed from office, and his vice president, Gerald Ford, took over. While this Watergate scandal was going on, the Congress, the US Congress now made sure that Nixon or Ford would have no power to re-intervene in Indochina, that they passed all sorts of bills which made it virtually impossible for the executive to become re-involved. In particular, what the Congress did was to sort of undercut American military and economic aid, further American military and economic aid to South Vietnam. Now, as I explained earlier, the economy in South Vietnam, especially after 1965 and the full-scale American involvement, was entirely based on this American and military and economic aid. In fact, it created boom conditions in the cities of Vietnam, as I have explained. But what we see now really is that American aid is progressively reduced. And with that, not only does the economic boom disappear, but increasingly the South Vietnamese government cannot meet its budgetary expenses. It can't pay its civil servants, the police, but especially the troops in the field, the armed troops, begin to well, they're not able to collect a paycheck. And so it becomes the whole machinery of the South Vietnamese army, but also the civil administration begins to wither. And remember, I explained that Thu's power rested on, there were these senior military officials and some political bureaucrats who were the instruments through which he governed. Well, these people had been used, there was a sort of flow of funds on the basis of which they exercise power. Well, it just all dries up. And so the whole mechanism begins to break down. To give you an idea of what was going on, in 1973, it cost about $3.5 billion a year for the United States to finance the South Vietnamese government, including the army. Well, in 1973, the US Congress voted only $2.3 billion. And the next year, 1974, $1.1 billion only in appropriations. So the whole apparatus began to sort of fall apart. Now, this is interesting, especially in the light of the fact that Nixon delivers this $10 billion of military equipment and so on, planes and tanks and what have you, to the South Vietnamese army. Well, Without this money, it's virtually impossible to take advantage of this military equipment. And furthermore, you could say that, yes, a lot of this equipment was very advanced, but the South Vietnamese army didn't have the expertise to operate a lot of these tanks or planes. They didn't have the technique to do so. Furthermore, this is all going on in the midst of what's called the first great oil crisis of the 70s. You'll remember the OPEC countries, the oil producing countries of the third world, Iran, Venezuela, what have you, they tripled the price of oil. And so oil was way more expensive, oil and gas. And therefore, whatever money was available, there wasn't enough to basically provide the fuel to all of this equipment. So this is the overall situation of the South Vietnamese government. But meanwhile, General Tu, faced with this situation, in his desperation, what he did was, remember the army was very large, it was 1.2 million troops. He tried to occupy as much territory as possible. Now, Pavin, as I explained in the last lecture, already occupied a considerable amount of South Vietnamese territory, but General Tu ordered the army to sort of disperse and occupy as much terrain as possible. Now, in mid-1973, he said that 80% of South Vietnam was under the occupation of the South Vietnamese army. But the reality was, first of all, that Pavin was established on South Vietnamese soil, and moreover, the National Liberation Front, the Viet Cong, if you will, they had fully reconstituted themselves by this point. You'll recall that after Tet, the US launched what they called accelerated pacification, including the Phoenix program, and they tried to root the communists out of the villages. Well, good luck. They were so deeply entrenched that really proved impossible. And gradually, between 68 and 73, 74, the National Liberation Front basically controls at night whatever Arvin is doing during the day, patrolling and so on, and ostensibly claiming to control things. At night, most of the countryside was under the control of the communists by 1973. Moreover, the communists were also building up the Ho Chi Minh Trail, continuing to build up the Ho Chi Minh Trail, paving over large parts of it, including parts of the trail that ran through Cambodia. Indeed, the whole between the demilitarized zone and the outskirts of Saigon, the Pavin built a paved road in Cambodia all along the frontier, down to close to the vicinity of Saigon, about 90 miles north. That's where the road stopped. And this is quite interesting. They also laid down an oil pipeline alongside the road, so that the trucks and the tanks coming down the Ho Chi Minh Trail could be supplied with fuel. So you can see the sophistication of the logistics of the communist side. Well, all told, we could say that as we get into 1974, the communist side had about 300,000 troops, in the south or in the immediate vicinity in Cambodia, compared to, say, the 1.2 million ARVN troops. The communist side was 1/4 as large, but of course, from a military point of view, many of these troops were battle hardened, they were inspired, and the ARVN, except for certain elite groups, was no match for these communist forces. Now, meanwhile, in the cities, the economic situation was deteriorating for reasons I've explained. And the general mood of the population was, of course, towards pacifism and neutralism. That's the urban population, including the middle class. And a first sign of what was going on appears on the 8th of September, 1974, when in Saigon, there is a demonstration. A group of Catholics, remember the Catholics had been one of the bulwarks of the regime in the South. Well, there is a demonstration led by a priest denouncing the two governments as basically corrupt and incompetent. And in the wake of that Catholic demonstration, the Buddhists now begin also to revive. Two had been able to suppress them after 1966. Their role had occurred between 63 and 66. After 66, two had control. When they reappear in the streets, the same thing, corruption, incompetence, they denounce these things. Of course, the police broke up these demonstrations, beat up people and so on, but nevertheless, these demonstrations were a straw in the wind. Now, back in the United States, the situation in the wake of Nixon's resignation was as follows. The new president, Gerald Ford, well, he had not been elected. He was installed by Nixon. The presidency was handed over. And so his position was weak. And he was confronted with some serious problems, even if he had been interested in going back into Vietnam. He was preoccupied by the fact that, well, as I said, he was a weak president, but also the economy in the United States itself was suffering from runaway inflation, way worse than what we see today in the present situation, plus a stagnation, much of it sort of induced by skyrocketing prices for oil and gas. The OPEC crisis had led to internal difficulties in the American economy that Ford was grappling with. Secondly, this is the very time of the so-called Yom Kippur War. That is to say, a war between the Israelis and the Arabs in 1974, which was a major crisis. The Israelis didn't do nearly as well as they did in 1967, the war of 1967. And so Ford essentially had to save their bacon. And so the Middle East became, which of course was the source of oil, became a major preoccupation. Finally, the détente between the United States and the Soviet Union was growing. There were further peace treaties and further economic deals, and the idea of sort of the United States re-entering in Indochina and Vietnam was the last thing that Ford was interested in doing. So it's at this point, in the fall of 1974, that the leadership in Hanoi called before it the commander-in-chief of the PAVN. His name was, let me see if, his name was General Van Tien Dung. And Dung, in front of the Politburo, lays out a plan for a renewal of the war and for the final conquest of South Vietnam. And General Dung, his plan called for launching of an offensive in 1975. He thought that it would take 2 years for South Vietnam to be fully conquered and General Tu to be overthrown. And that in the wake of that, there would be a kind of coalition government, which would ultimately lead to the reunification of the North and the South. That was the initial plan. So this is October. Well, already in December of 1974, the PAVN decides to test the waters. I'm trying now to bring up a map here. This is the beginning of the end now. This is what I'm talking about now. What I'm going to describe here is a sequence of battles which basically lead to the collapse of the South Vietnamese army. The ARVN collapses in the face of the communist offensive. And it occurs at 3 key points. In contrast to the offensive, the so-called Easter Offensive of 1972, where you'll recall the communists start out crossing the DMZ, then they attack Kontum in the Central Highlands, and finally they attack close to Saigon, crossing the Cambodian border. In the Parrot's Beak region, they threatened Saigon. That's the sequence: DMZ, Central Highlands, and then across the Cambodian frontier towards Saigon. It's the reverse in 1975 because the action starts at a place called, you find it, Phuc Long, which is more or less the same region where the 1972 offensive occurred. In December 1974, 2 divisions of the PAVN cross from Cambodia and they take up positions before this provincial city of Phuc Long. General Tu orders a full-scale defense of this position, which is about 90 miles from Saigon. But in basically 3 weeks, the communists are able to overrun Phuc Long, and the ARVN retreats towards Saigon in disarray. So the communists have taken over this province and this provincial city within striking distance, we could say, of the city of Saigon. Now let me, just 1 second. Yeah. The second, so this first occurs, here's Saigon, it's now called Ho Chi Minh City, and this is where they first struck in December 74. But then given that in the middle of March, and especially the communist side noticed that the Americans were doing nothing. they didn't intervene uh, to try and save the situation here. So the communists decided on an even larger scale, this time in the central highlands. This area is near the Cambodian border. This is up in the central highlands. In the central highlands there, they run more or less this way in terms of the geography of South Vietnam. And in the very north is the city of Kon Tum, which we saw was besieged in 72. In the middle, there's this another city and a big American air base at a place called Pleiku. And finally, to the south, the major town is a place called Bon Ma Thuot. Bon Ma Thuot, the major city in the south. See, I've listed it here as Pleiku, Kon Tum, and Ban Ma Thuot. So they attacked, instead of attacking Kon Tum or Pleiku, they attacked the most important city in the southern part of the Central Highlands. This attack begins on the 10th of March, 1975. 5 PAVA divisions, this time joined by tanks and artillery, anti-aircraft weapons, and all sort of facilitated by engineers. They attacked this southern city, and within a week, that is to say, the midweek, March 75, this city now falls to the communist side. And then in response to that, General Tu, he makes a major mistake. General Tu makes a major strategic mistake. So this provincial capital here has fallen, and now this important city in the south of the Central Highlands has fallen. And faced with this situation, General Tu is sitting down in Saigon. He says to his officers, you know what? We're going to evacuate the whole of the Central Highlands, and indeed, we're going to evacuate all our forces up around Hue. All of the forces in the northern part of South Vietnam should be evacuated at this point. And we're going to reconcentrate our forces in the very south of South Vietnam. In other words, he's going to try and hold the Mekong Delta region, where a lot of the rice comes from. He's going to try and hold on to Saigon. And he's going to try and hold on to some of these coastal cities around here. But the rest of it, the Central Highlands and the northern province, including Hue, he's going to abandon. Now, where did he get this idea of reconcentration? Well, the Americans that originally had this idea. In the middle of the war after 1965, when the Americans, between 1965 and 1968, were involved in their big buildup and their big push, they were taking a lot of casualties. As I've explained, these were big battles, especially in 1967 and 68. So some planners, Pentagon planners, came up with the idea of what they called the enclave. That is to say, in order to hold on to South Vietnam, but reduce the American commitment, especially the casualties. The way to do this was basically to do as I just said, reconstitute the forces to make sure that you hold on to the rice region of the South, you hold on to the Saigon, and you hold on to some of the towns along the coast, and you let the communists have the rest. which from a strategic point of view is less important. And so that was the theory on which Tu based his new strategy. Remember, at the beginning, he was trying to hold on to all this territory. Well, now he completely reverses himself and goes over to this enclave theory. Well, he sends orders to the troops, to the commanders in the north and the commanders in the Central Highlands, particularly at Pleiku, right here, and Khartoum here, evacuate as soon as possible. Evacuate as soon as possible. Now, there are thousands and thousands of armed troops in these two towns, plus their families and various people hanging around in the cities of Khartoum and Pleiku. Suddenly, the order is given: evacuate. There's no planning. There's no preparation for this at all, and the result is there is a complete panic. And willy-nilly, the people up in Pleiku, in Khartoum, soldiers, civilians, what have you, in the tens, indeed hundreds of thousands, begin to flee down the highways, small highways, toward the coast. And meanwhile, the Pavan is sitting up in the hills, and they're using mortars and artillery against this vast crowds coming down these highways, fleeing, terrified soldiers and troops. And the result was, of the 60,000 Arvan troops up in Pleiku and Khartoum, 2/3 of them are basically killed by the communists, and there were many, many civilian casualties as well. Indeed, most of the tens of thousands never even made it to the coast. They just had to stop wherever they were, and they were overrun by the advancing communist forces. So that's the first leg of this. So to recapitulate, it starts down here, as I've explained. Across the Cambodian border is the first thrust. They take Phuc Long, then the communists attack Bon Man Thot, and it is taken, and it precipitates a panic, and this panicky evacuation from the Central Highlands. But meanwhile, word of all this, of course, reached the northern provinces as well, Hue and all of the troops along the demilitarized zone. And what you have is the communist side, seeing what's happening, they now send 5 divisions of the Pavan across the demilitarized zone, and more or less the same thing happens in the north. The Arvan defense completely collapses. People in the towns, including Hue, panic, and there is what people are just trying to save themselves. And this huge mass of people rushes down highway number 1, trying to save whatever they can, save themselves, trying to they hope somehow that they can reach safety in Saigon and so on. Of course, it's a pipe dream. And so the communist forces overrun Hue, they overrun Da Nang, the major American naval base in the north, and the communist troops begin to advance from town to town along the coast. All of this is now occupied by the communists. So the communists basically now control all of the north. All of the towns now fall to the communists. The Central Highlands are occupied by them. And indeed, communist forces are massing across the Cambodian border in the direction of Saigon. That is the situation. Meanwhile, everywhere there are refugees of course, who are caught up in this terrorizing situation. The communists reach Da Nang is up here, and further south is the second major artificial port that the Americans have built at Cam Ranh Bay, which is even larger than Da Nang, and it's filled with all kinds of American military equipment, including planes. And indeed, this Cam Ranh Bay falls without a shot to the communist side. The army simply abandons it and flees to the south. So with that, the virtually all parts of South Vietnam, with the exception of the area around Saigon, have fallen to the communists at this point. We're talking about April 1975. Now, at this point, General Dong issues an order, and the communists realize that, in fact, rather than waiting for or fighting for 2 years, the whole thing is disintegrating. The whole of the enemy is disintegrating right in front of their eyes. So General Dong orders all of the troops in these various areas to assemble around Saigon for the final siege of the two governments. And he ordered the troops to prepare for the final campaign, which he calls the Ho Chi Minh Campaign. Ho Chi Minh had died in 1969. He was the revered leader of the Republic of Vietnam. And of course, so the final campaign is named after him. And as you can see on this map, when the city is taken, it's given a new name. The name of Saigon is displaced, and the new name of the southernmost important city is Ho Chi Minh City. That's the name that it has until this day. By mid-April, advanced elements of the PAVN began to approach the outskirts of Saigon, and there was I'm trying to find it on. There was a final battle about 30 miles east of Saigon on Highway number 1 is a place called Chuan Loc. And there, whatever remained of Arvin, and these were the good troops, the small number of troops, maybe 20,000, who fought well, they made a last stand, and they were able to hold up the PAVN for about a week. And this was the final battle of the war, and along route number 1. When that battle was over, the way was open to the conquest of Saigon. Meanwhile, as this lightning campaign was unfolding, as this last campaign was unfolding, back in Washington, the Ford administration was watching these events as they unfolded. And the decision had been taken as soon as this started that there would be no further American involvement, including air power, that the United States would not even intervene from the air to try and protect the two governments. It's true that on the 10th of April, Ford appealed to the Congress for an emergency grant of $725 million for the two governments based on the pleading of President Tu, but the Congress notably refused to grant this emergency grant. They categorically refused to have anything further to do with Vietnam. They had written off Vietnam, and of course, This was in line overwhelmingly with American public opinion. The American public had turned its back on South Vietnam. So it was that on the 21st of April, President Chu announced his resignation while this was in a broadcast, and he denounced the betrayal of the United States. According to Chu, the United States had betrayed the Republic of South Vietnam. And Chu handed over power to his vice president, an old bureaucrat by the name of Tran Van Wang, a person without any power or influence, was given the vice presidential power. And this vice president appealed for negotiations. But of course, at this point, why would the communists negotiate? Instead, they were busy basically assembling 10 divisions of the PAVN for the final conquest of South Vietnam, of Saigon and the Republic of Vietnam. On the 23rd of April, President Ford flew to New Orleans and delivered an address, a speech, to an audience at Tulane University down in New Orleans. Tulane University. There's, I guess, LSU, and then there's Tulane down in New Orleans. Well, at Tulane, before a large audience, he spoke about Vietnam, and he said as follows: America can regain the sense of pride that existed before Vietnam, but it cannot be achieved by refighting a war that is finished as far as America is concerned. It's no longer the Congress, it's the President of the United States basically kissing off to and the Republic of Vietnam. And the audience responded with wild, that's only the way you can describe it, wild and prolonged cheers on the part of the audience in response to Ford's words. So then, the last thing that happens, of course, is the final evacuation of Saigon, which I'm describing at this point. Now, the people who were most anxious to get out were, of course, those people who were involved with the Americans, all those South Vietnamese who had worked for the Americans, were complicit in the government of the Republic of Vietnam, or who were wealthy business people. These people, but also certainly many others, Catholics, all kinds of people who felt that they were in danger from a communist takeover, rushed to get out if they could. And the US Congress did vote for 130,000 emergency visas to facilitate the evacuation of these Vietnamese. And it was the US Air Force from the Saigon airport that organized this airlift of these vulnerable people, as many of us as possible, to get out. And meanwhile, the communist encirclement got stronger and stronger. On April 27th, the communists began to shell the city. And on that date, it's significant, this vice president who'd taken over, he in turn resigned and turned things over to General Big Min, the neutralist, was handed power. And once again, he appealed for negotiations to no avail. On the 29th of April, communist troops broke into the suburbs of Saigon. And that same day, the airport came under heavy fire, including air attack, because PAVN pilots had seized the jets, the American jets at Cam Ranh Bay. They were flying them, and they flew them and attacked ARVN positions in the region of Saigon. So the communists were using American planes to bomb the ARVN. And at this point, Ford ordered the complete evacuation of the remaining Americans and whoever they could of the communist side. And so what ensued then was an indescribable scene of havoc and mayhem and rioting, because the Americans organized this evacuation at various points in the city. They tried to assemble people at the airport, and they began to using hundreds and hundreds of helicopters because they couldn't fly in planes because of the fire. They used helicopters to fly out thousands of civilians and officials and so on out of Saigon. Meanwhile, the people left behind who wanted to leave, most of them never made it out, and they were left standing in these various places. So there was huge rioting and terrible scenes, looters everywhere, fires everywhere, chaos, ultimate chaos. Finally, the US Embassy itself was evacuated. The final 2,000 Americans and some Vietnamese were helicoptered out of the city to the airport, where they were further helicoptered to US carriers waiting offshore. On the 30th of April, the US ambassador himself flew out of Saigon off the roof of the US Embassy, leaving some 500 people standing, waiting for refuge, standing around the grounds of the embassy. And one of the US officials who accompanied the ambassador later wrote, as he was flying off, he wrote that he could think of no word in any language adequate to describe the sense of shame that swept over me, the humiliation of this defeat. And in the wake of this American evacuation, about noon on that same day, the 30th, communist Pavan tank corps rumbled down the main street of Saigon, past the American embassy and towards the presidential palace. The leading tank broke down the fence and drove up to the steps of the presidential palace, and a single soldier got out of the tank waving a flag of the National Liberation Front and raced up the stairs of the presidential palace. Inside the palace were big men waiting to hand over power to the Pavan, to the commander of the Pavan. A certain general, a colonel, Bui Tin, was the commanding officer at that time. And Big Nin made a gesture of handing over his pistol and power to Bu Tin. And Bu Tin refused to accept a surrender for him in the following words: your power has crumbled. You cannot give up. You cannot surrender what you do not have. That is to say, you have lost power, and we have the power. That was the end of the final offensive that lasted 55 days. Now, to conclude, I have one more minute. Vietnam had paid a heavy price. 3.5 million people perished in the Vietnam War between 1965 and 1975. 3.5 million, and we're not even counting the additional 3 million in Cambodia and the other million in Laos. It's a total of about 8 million people perished on the Indo-Chinese people perished. And of course, these countries were devastated. It took years to rebuild. On the other hand, what we can say about Vietnam was they had defeated the greatest power in the world. The United States of America went down to defeat in Vietnam. Furthermore, Vietnam was an independent and united country as a result of this war. And I would say, I'll just end off by saying that Vietnam today is a country of over 100 million people. It's at peace. And its development is certainly not at the level of China, but it is a prosperous country. Vietnam is a peaceful country and a prosperous country. So I bid you a Merry Christmas, and we'll see you on the 5th of January.
Merry Christmas. Thank you.